I'd like to welcome you all to our April Lunch and Learn webinar, from multimedia to social media to augmented and virtual reality, changing technologies and their use in technical communication, with Jeremy Merritt. Jeremy's been a technical communicator since 2001, and he's worked in a variety of fields, such as manufacturing, health insurance, software engineering, biopharmaceuticals, and metallurgical processing. He has a master's degree in technical and scientific communication from Miami University, and he's currently pursuing a PhD in rhetoric and scientific and technical communication at the University of Minnesota. So thank you, Jeremy, for joining us and presenting this to us today. And you can get started anytime now.
Thank you, Karen. I'm just doing a sound check once again. Can everyone hear me, at least Karen and presumably others?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I will share my screen. Hopefully this will work.
Yes.
Thank you
Let
again.
me do that.
Okay.
I need to change. That's my thing. Jeremy, there we go.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to go on the safe side, and I'm going to share my entire screen rather than the application window, because I think that'll make sure, hopefully, that we are able to see everything that is on the screen. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and I'm going to move over.
Oh. Okay. Did we just lose audio? I'm getting a message from Danielle. Danielle, can you hear me? Message me in the screen.
I can hear you, but no one else.
Okay. Oh, Joan can still hear. Jeremy, can you hear me? All right. Uh-oh. Hello?
We're going to talk about the topic of multimedia to social media to augmented and virtual reality, changing technologies and their use in technical communication. As Karen said, my name is Jeremy Merritt. I'm a PhD candidate and a graduate instructor at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and I'm in my third year of the program. And thanks to Karen and a couple of other people, I'm able to present to you today on this topic of changing technologies and their use in tech comm. So thank you for having me. Just a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about today before we have some question opportunities and opportunities for further discussion. I'm going to be talking about technical communication and its relationship to technology. I'm also going to be talking a little bit for just a couple of minutes about this so-called academy industry gap that's really important when we try to think about the context of tech comm and technology. I'm going to talk a bit about social and network technologies, augmented and virtual reality, technological literacy, implications for the work that we do as technical communicators, and then I'm just going to ask some questions and try to give some initial thoughts about the future of our field related to today's topic, and that might lead us into an opportunity for some further discussion. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about technical communication and technology, and I describe this relationship as a symbiotic relationship. In other words, technical communication cannot exist without technology, and technology is something that makes technical communication a distinctive field with broad applications in industry practice. And I'm going to talk a little bit about philosophically how that bears out. So technical communication and technology have a very long relationship, and you'll see interspersed throughout this presentation various citations, and I'll have some references at the end that I can provide for everyone after the presentation as well. But Catherine Durack, in an article called From the Moon to the Microchip, 50 Years of Technical Communication, really did a good job of talking about how technical communication as a field really parallels scientific and technological advancements that date back to at least the 1950s. So even though I wouldn't necessarily say TechCom started in the 1950s, what we think of as a field of practice, a lot of the origins for academic programs, even STC, can date back to that decade. And Durack says that the tools that we use are intimately connected with our roles as technical communication professionals and as teachers of technical communication. They affect expectations about our productivity in the workplace and about the nature of our work itself. And finally, she says they affect expectations about our roles and capabilities, about our autonomy. And I think that's a really important quote as we think about the relationship between TechCom and the technologies that we work with and that our users work with. Something else, David Dobrin in 1983 pointed out the fact that technology, again, is what helps make technical communication as a field distinctive. He even offered this definition that's one of the shorter definitions among many for technical writing. He says that technical writing is writing that accommodates technology to the user, which is directly related to what we're talking about today. And then it's important to note some of the software and technologies that are used in technical communication today. So one category can be thought of as what I call software for software. So in other words, software that we use for the purpose of coding, that we use for the purpose of structured authoring with data, for commenting on code as we develop user documentation. Software used in content creation and management, so that could be programs like Adobe Photoshop, Illustrator, Adobe Premiere for video editing, Audacity, content management systems such as WordPress and others. Software or devices that we use in usability and user experience testing. Examples may include eye tracking and video recording devices. And then other tools that we use for the purpose of project management, as many have probably already seen. Technical writers are increasingly asked to take upon some fairly specialized project management roles, as well as presentation tools. And I think this is a really important slide, and I've purposely kept it fairly simple. So this whole thing about technology and TechCom, what are some of the workplace expectations that we encounter on a day-to-day basis in our work as technical communicators? Well, for one thing, we have expectations for a certain baseline level of competency. In other words, when we go in for an interview or when we start a job and as we continue throughout that job, we're expected to have certain baseline competencies in using some of the software that I mentioned on the previous slide. It might be coding software, it might be graphic design software, it might be project management software, word processing, and what have you. Now, these next two pieces of workplace expectations are something that I certainly wouldn't say are unique to technical communication, but I think it's really important to think about the fact that employers expect us to have a certain level of educability and adaptability. Educability meaning, as technical communicators, we are expected to be able to learn new technologies on a regular basis. And oftentimes those technologies are not the types of things that would appear in an initial job description. At least, it might fall under the, that bullet point that says other duties as assigned or other skills as needed. So this whole idea of being educable and learning new technologies is a really important piece of technical communication practice. And I know that that's something that I didn't think about when I first started as a technical communicator quite as much. And then this other bullet point with adaptability. We have to be adaptable with the technologies not only that we use, but also with the technologies that our users, that our end users and stakeholders are going to be utilizing. So that kind of creates a kind of a double-pronged challenge and actually a really great opportunity for us as technical communicators, because we have to use certain skills and software and technologies that we use every day in our work, but we also have to be familiar with the technologies and software that our stakeholders are going to be using as well. Something I want to touch on just very, very briefly, and you'll see why this is important for establishing the context of the rest of this talk today. It's this whole thing about an academy industry gap, and maybe some of you have various thoughts on this, and as I said, I don't want to take a whole lot of time to talk about it, but I do just want to mention it for context. So the idea of the academy industry gap is that there is a certain gap or a certain division between the academic and practical or practice-oriented sides, if you will, of technical communication. And Michael Albers really spoke to this pretty well in an article in Technical Communication from 2016, when he said that academics' research is poorly communicated to practitioners. He said that's an unsurprising but disconcerting statement, considering the technical communication is inherently practical. At the same time, he says there is a gulf of communicating practitioner needs to academics. Okay? Saint-Amand and Melanson also talked about a lack of research question alignment. So, in other words, the research needs of practitioners are not always completely aligned with the research questions that academics are asking. And then in another article from 2004, a couple of researchers spoke about differences in expectations and reward structures in academic TechCom and then in the kind of the industry side of TechCom. And that creates certain opportunities and certain challenges. So what are the opportunities here? And I think this is really important. This creates opportunities, not only the opportunity, but a very strong need for collaborations between academics and people in industry, people who are working in technical writing. It creates an opportunity to create research questions that are aligned, with industry needs. It creates opportunities for regular conversations between academics and practitioners. And it also creates opportunities for organizational partnerships through organizations like STC that help really do a very good job of bridging that gap between the academy and industry. And that's something that I really try to do in a lot of my work. Okay. What are some examples? So I just mentioned that there are some challenges with kind of unifying academic and industry approaches to technical communication. But one of the great things about having the academic side or the research side of TechCom, if you will, is that we do have a lot of spaces where ongoing research is taking place. And these are just a few of those examples. One is the Emerging Technologies Research Collaboratory, or ETRC, at the University of Minnesota. This is actually a group that I've been involved with for a couple of years. And we're constantly working with different wearable technologies, augmented and virtual reality, and trying to find different ways in which those technologies can be applied in technical communication practice. I'm going to talk about a few of those examples here in a few minutes. Another example, just briefly, would be the Writing Information and Digital Experience Group, or WIDE, at Michigan State. And then finally, one of the longest standing research spaces related to technical communication and technical writing would be the Digital Writing and Research Lab at the University of Texas at Austin. And these are just a few examples to illustrate. I just included a couple of very quick screenshots of websites for two of those academic research spaces. So the one on the left is actually the Digital Writing and Research Lab at the University of Texas at Austin. And then on the right is an example of a web page from the Emerging Technologies Research Collaboratory here at Minnesota. So the first area of technology that I really want to focus on includes social and network technologies, Web 2.0 and beyond. And it's kind of the question that I'm asking here and exploring is, how do these social and network technologies in Web 2.0 and in other contexts really affect the work that we do as technical communicators and the work that we will continue to do in the future. Okay. So something about the growth of Web 2.0 and social media as it applies to technical communication is the fact that technology and user experience are social, they're participatory, and they are iterative. So before the explosion of Web 2.0 and social media and related technologies, we didn't necessarily have this kind of social, participatory, audience involved, so to speak, perspective on documentation and user experience. Now we're having users who work directly with or communicate rather directly with engineers, directly with technical writers who are working on documentation, web, and other content. We also have a very iterative process, meaning that documentation is not static. Documentation is extremely dynamic, so we are constantly working within this kind of social and participatory framework that technical communication is a part of today to improve and revise our documentation on a regular basis. And that's where the iterative piece of this kind of new audience-involved perspective in TechCom really takes place. Something that Miles Kimball said, he's really saying a lot more than this in the article I'm referring to, but in this article called The Golden Age of Technical Communication, he has this pretty well-known quote where he says, "We are all technical communicators." And the idea behind that is that users and stakeholders and managers and others are all taking part in this iterative process of documentation and helping one another out. So it's not just us as technical communicators who are kind of owning that process. We are constantly interacting with our users and other stakeholders. And then in a recent book, and it's actually a really good book that I would recommend, I have a citation for it that, again, I can share. Just came out this year. Dr. Leanne Kessman-Broy talks about this idea of social web usability. So what she's basically saying in this book is that, again, kind of going back to the social participatory and iterative model within social media, she's saying, well, we can get usability data not simply from using formal usability testing, as many of us are trained to do, but also going to audience-involved fora, for example, on social media, on message boards, and other places on the web, using that data to improve the usability and user experience of, she's talking mainly about websites, but also any kind of communication that technical communicators are involved in creating and revising. Another important consideration here is the idea of the virtual workspace. So traditional views of workspaces really no longer suffice, and I know as a teacher of technical writing, that's a challenge that I and many other people have. Practitioners maybe might have a better idea of how these kind of evolving workspaces work just because they're out in the field. But you'll kind of see this image on the right. We kind of talk about this a lot in some of my work here at the university. That is Tina, the technical writer, from the comic strip Dilbert. And one of the ideas here is that, Tina is often working with, you see her with this big stack of paper, and she's kind of working at a desk in a cubicle, and this kind of traditional model of the workplace. And the point with that is that image really doesn't suffice anymore. It happens, but it's much more involved than that. So workspaces, like technology and user experience, are social and networked. A really good article on that is an article from Stacy Pig from 2014, where she talks about social media's role in distributed work, including the work that technical communicators do. Also, this idea that workspace and technology are really inseparable. With the rise of technologies like Slack and Skype and Zoom and GoToMeeting and WebEx and all these other things, very much like we're using today for this presentation, you really cannot separate the workspace from the technology that underlies it in many cases. This whole idea of people, so in our audiences, our stakeholders, they're ethereal, and I use that word meaning they're not situated in a physical setting. They're located out in the ether, if you will. And that creates challenges and opportunities for us as technical communicators as we think about audience analysis and other things. And then finally, technical communicators must continually adapt to these changing realities in a way that prior to the growth of Web 2.0 and social media really was not quite as rapid and not quite as extensive, I think, arguably, as it is today. So what are some what is an example of how this might bear out in industry practice? Well, you know, I've already talked about things like the fact that learning new software, learning different augmented reality platforms and so on may be an unstated expectation of our jobs as technical writers, even though it may not appear in our job description or in a job ad that we're applying to. But one example of how this kind of technological, social networked aspect of our work may bear out, if you think about the typical day of a technical writer, we might arrive first thing in the morning, check our email, review our calendar. We might have to meet with field salespeople in Malaysia via WebEx. Then maybe a couple hours later, we may have to conduct a focus group user experience session in a makeshift lab. And I think the key here is makeshift because here at the university, I know at Minnesota, we have this really nice usability lab that's kind of soundproof, and we have all this really cool equipment like eye tracking devices and so forth. In a lot of cases in industry, we have to work with what we can get. So that's why I say kind of a makeshift lab in order to conduct some usability testing. Then maybe later we have to communicate with users via Facebook about product issues documentation that was recently added to your responsibilities list. We may have to create a product information video using other recently developed skills in a program like Adobe Premiere. And then finally, at the end of the day, because we haven't had time to do anything else, we'll check our email again because we didn't have time to do it since first thing this morning when we got in. And these are some of the things, this is just kind of an example of how the lives of technical writers are becoming more complicated as time goes on. So another area I want to talk about is augmented and virtual reality. So how do augmented and virtual reality present new frontiers in user experience and technical communication? Okay. Just a couple of quick definitions. We talk about augmented reality and virtual reality, and I'm sure many of you in the audience have probably already had some experience using various AR and VR platforms. But when we talk about augmented reality, we're really talking about an element of user experience that is layered upon an existing reality, the reality that we are all familiar with. And then there's some examples. Virtual reality is a technologically mediated reality or a technologically created reality in which the parameters of user experience may be independent from the user's schema or what the user is used to. Okay. One of the researchers that I work with here at Minnesota has been working and actually has a chapter coming out in an edited collection that deals with augmented reality in content creation. And this image is kind of an adapted timeline, if you will, of how augmented reality has developed over the years. So you can see these authors, Dr. Doohan and her two co-authors, are tracing the development of augmented reality all the way back to 1968. And then you can see that development has moved forward since then. And then nowadays we get into things like Pokemon Go, we've had Google Glass in the past, Apple releases, you know, its own AR platform for the iPhone. So there's a long history to augmented reality that certainly I was not really aware of until I started looking into this topic over the last couple of years. So how do augmented and virtual reality bear out in user experience and technical communication? And what do we need to be aware of and think about when we are designing communications that involve augmented and virtual reality? One thing is this idea of user expectations. So we're always thinking about the user. We're always thinking about audience analysis and usability and a whole host of other things as technical communicators. But something that Doohan, Armfield, and Peterson talk about is how these expectations are really amplified and expanded in the context of augmented and virtual reality. They're really talking about augmented reality, but I would make the argument that a lot of those arguments extend to virtual reality as well. So something that these three authors say is that one way to think about and study content development and content strategy is to consider the role of the designer and the designer's participation in that design as both the designer and the audience. To understand the participatory design approach to content development, we focus on empathy, accessibility, usability, and universal design. Okay, and I bolded those 5 terms: participatory design, where the technical communicator or designer is actually both a designer and an audience member. And then also this idea of empathy, thinking about what the user needs, thinking about the user's experience, feelings, cognitions, accessibility. Is the communication, or is the experience, I should say, accessible to people of varying abilities? Usability. Is that technology usable to a broad audience? And then universal design. Does the design enable a fairly expansive audience to utilize it effectively? Okay. And then here is, these are the 6 elements of what these authors are calling an augmented reality journey. And I took this, Dr. Doohan was kind enough to let me use this image, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about this augmented reality journey in the next slide or two. But you can see that there are different elements to this augmented reality journey that these authors are basically saying we as technical communicators need to think about as we are moving through the communication design process. Another argument they make is that human-centered content design for AR is about designing for the total experience, and that is a key term, the total experience, this augmented journey that I mentioned on the previous slide. As content designers, we move beyond document design and usability of a product toward embracing the total experience. And then finally, they say human-centered content design for AR requires intense focus on seeing audience as immersed in journeys. Okay, so what are some things, again, and this is just kind of the last part that, Doohan, Armfield, and Peterson talk about with respect to augmented reality and virtual reality and technical communication. They talk about authenticity. What is the audience's point of view? They talk about this idea of embodiment. How might I position the audience in this augmented place? They talk about empathy. What does my audience think or feel in certain ways? Again, accessibility. Can my audience access or experience this augmented environment? Usability. Is the environment usable for various audiences? Experience. What journeys does my audience seek, and how might I augment each experience? And then finally, this concept of immersion. Immersive experience is something we talk a lot about these days in technical communication. How might the augmentation allow me as a designer, as a technical communicator, to create experiences not possible in the physical world? How might I stretch and magnify the audience's role? Okay. Something else I want to mention is technological literacy, and many of us in the audience have probably already heard of this idea, but I want to emphasize it just briefly because I think it is really important when we think about the technologies that we are working with and the technologies that our users need to work with in the work that they're doing. Okay, literacies in technical communication. What do those literacies look like? So when we talk about literacy in technical communication, we're really talking about a certain kind of strand or a certain spectrum of capabilities. So when we talk about one of the commonly used models when we talk about literacies in technical communication is this concept of layered literacies from Kelly Cargill Cook, and she talks about basic, rhetorical, social, technological, ethical, and critical literacies. And each of these literacies, starting with basic, then rhetorical, social, and so on, is kind of layered upon the other. And that's been a widely used and cited model both in the teaching of technical writing and in technical communication practice. Then this idea of multiliteracies, I just wanted to mention from Stuart Selber, functional, rhetorical, and critical. And you'll see a couple of overlaps there, at least in terminology, with the layered literacies model that Carl Cook talked about. And then more recently, and I think this is especially relevant to today's discussion, this idea of digital literacies that Rachel Spilka in her edited collection from 2009 talked about. But what I really want to focus on for our purposes today is this idea of technological literacies. So what does a technological literacy in technical communication look like? Okay. So technological literacy in tech comm, as defined by Carl Cook, and this really encompasses a very broad range of technologies, including social and network technologies, including virtual workspaces, including augmented and virtual reality, among other areas relevant to tech comm. So Kelly Carl Cook says that technological literacy includes a working knowledge of technologies that helps professional communicators to produce communications, documents, or products, and awareness of how these technologies promote social interactions and collaboration, an ability to research how users work with the technologies, and finally, an ability to critique this research and act upon it to make decisions and produce documents designed with and for users. And I think it's really important, and this really speaks to the practitioner side of what we do as technical writers. So in those third and fourth bullet points, she talks about this ability to research and the ability to critique research. In my mind, she's talking not only about academic research per se, she's also talking about the research that we have to do every day as technical writers. And that kind of research includes research on content, documentation, user experience, who are the personas with which we're working and trying to reach in terms of our user base. So, and again, that speaks to another idea that I talked about, this idea of aligning academic and research questions with industry needs. And I wanted to mention here the very last point on this slide, technological literacy becomes part of, but is not the only important component in coordinating user experience, content design, and the technologies that underlie them. Okay. So what are some of the implications for technical communication practice in terms of making the technology, making these changing technologies relevant to what we do on a daily basis, and just as importantly, what we're going to do in the future? Well, one of the things that I did in preparation for this talk and this discussion is that I reached out to a couple of people that I've already mentioned. And one of those people is Dr. Lisa Melanson at the University of South Florida, who does a lot of research related to audience experience. And one of the areas that I really like to go to her for in terms of her the work that she's done is this kind of relationship between the academy and industry that I talked about early in this presentation. And Dr. Melanson said that the basic, and I'm going to go ahead and quote these because I think they're just really, really important. She said that even with all of this technological change, the basic tenets of tech comm have not changed, and we can't lose focus of these primary skills, particularly audience analysis and our use of words, images, and so on. Actually, she says, audience analysis becomes even more important in these new spaces. And then secondly, she says we need to continue building a technological literacy that moves across tools and platforms. This is done through listening to subject matter experts or being unafraid to play and practice and experiment. So what are some takeaways from these two points from Dr. Melanson? Well, one thing is that I think it's very easy as a technical communicator, at least for me as a technical communicator, to think about the technology as the primary object of my work, or as the primary focus of my work. So as I'm learning something like I mentioned Adobe Premiere, I mentioned, various structured authoring tools like DITA and so forth. I spend so much time trying to learn these new technologies that I may at times, hopefully not too much, lose focus on, the primary reason for my being a technical communicator, which is to reach a particular audience and to provide content in an understandable, usable, and accessible manner to that audience. And that's something that I take away from that first point from Dr. Melanson. And then secondly, this whole idea of technological literacy that I just spoke about before, Dr. Melanson reflects on that and says that building technological literacy is extremely important, not just in terms of using and learning the technologies that underlie the work we do, but also listening to other stakeholders, our audiences, subject matter experts. And she talks about being unafraid to play and practice and experiment in kind of these different spaces. We may need to be kind of brave in using the technologies, knowing we're not always going to use them completely effectively in the beginning, but as we work with them and as we work with the people that know them best, we're going to become better and better at using them, and consequently better and better in our jobs as technical writers. I want to come back to, and then we'll kind of turn this over in a few minutes to some questions and opportunity for discussion. I want to think about, expectations and realities in industry, including these kind of virtual social and network spaces that I've already talked about. Earlier, I talked about this idea of having a certain set of baseline competencies going into a technical writing job. This idea of educability, or in other words, the ability to learn new technologies, and then finally adaptability, being able to adapt to the needs of users and the technologies that we're working with in our careers. So one question that I would ask everyone, and we might have an opportunity to talk about this today, how do these expectations and realities bear out in today's workplace and also in the larger picture of our work as technical communicators? So the first part, the workplaces that we are a part of in our jobs and our careers, and also when I talk about this bigger picture, kind of taking a step back, when we think about the long look of our careers, when we think about the future of our profession, what do these expectations and realities mean for us as we continue to move forward in our field and as we try to help advocate for our field and advocate for its growth in this changing technological marketplace? And then just a couple more slides, and I'm going to turn it back over to Karen for some Q&A and possibly some discussion here. Questions to consider about our future. As technical communicators, how do we stay current with and ahead of technological change? I know that second part might be difficult because it is very difficult. I know that when I was in undergrad in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was some groundwork laid for augmented and virtual reality. AOL Instant Messenger was a thing, but I would say that those kind of social network spaces were not as extensive as they are today. How do we anticipate and respond to user expectations, particularly as they relate to the different technologies that users are interested in and need to use in their day-to-day lives? How do we anticipate and respond to employer expectations? Kind of going back to those 3 points, 2 of them being educability and adaptability. What are our employers' expectations now, and what will they be in the future, and how do we anticipate and respond to them? And then finally, and I think this is really important, how do we utilize technology to improve our own experiences as technical communicators? So when I teach technical writing, I often talk about a couple of different kinds of advocacy. Certainly one of the most important kinds is user advocacy, advocating for the interests and the experiences of our users. But also we need to advocate for ourselves. We need to advocate for our own experiences and quality of work, or quality of working conditions. So how do we utilize technology to kind of advocate for ourselves and to improve our own experiences? I wanted to share just a few acknowledgements for contributing to this session. Dr. Anhil Dewan, Dr. Lise Melanson, Dr. Jason Tom, And also I wanted to thank Karen Levine and Joan Bloomberg. I'm sure there were many others, but I wanted to offer these few acknowledgments for helping to make this session possible today. I also wanted to thank everyone for being a part of this session today. You're more than welcome to reach out to me via email and or LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to talk to you about this topic or more broadly about technical communication as a field. I love this field. That's why I teach it. That's why I do it. And I'm always very happy to discuss it further. And then a few references for your interest, and I'd be very happy to share these with everyone through Karen. So thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this back over to Karen, and we can try to see if there's an opportunity for some Q&A and maybe some reflection on today's session.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. Since we don't have everyone muted, I think rather than having everybody type into the chat, if someone has a question, just speak up, and we'll see if that works.
Sounds good.
Okay, I'm not sure. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
There's a light on my thing that says I'm muted, but I'm like, but my microphone's down. This is Danielle. I'm the president. I'm the Big Mouth and president of the STC chapter, Philadelphia chapter. Jeremy, I think my big question, listening to everything, I think there's a lot of really great points that you've pointed out, because I'm a person who did go through my master's back in, I think I graduated in 2012, so it's been 7 years, and I'm still kind of new to technical communications, but kind of not anymore. Why and there's a lot of things that you said about like the disconnect between academic and what I like to call real world that I try to teach even with my own graduate courses that I teach at NJIT. I think the big question that I have for you is, why did you decide to concentrate only on the technical writing aspect of technical communications? Because I think part of the big thing right now is that technical writing is one aspect, and there is a need for those, but there's also a huge need for content strategists and UX strategists and people who do that. And even within the content strategy market, I've found that most of the time employers are looking for marketing people, not, they want somebody who understands content strategy, but you're really a marketer, and that makes it really difficult to find jobs that really concentrate solely on true content strategy, and you have to kind of know a little bit of everything. So what kind of things have you found in really trying to make something of a well-rounded technical communicator versus focusing solely on the technical writing aspects of things?
Definitely. First of all, it's a really pleasure to meet you, Danielle, and I'm glad that you've had the opportunity to work with graduate students, and you make a really good point about the kind of the broad applicability of this whole concept of user experience and technologies and so forth, not just technical communication per se, but also to content strategy and user experience and information design. So one thing, and I probably should have mentioned this at the beginning as well, but when I talk about technical communication as a field, and this is very true, I teach and I do not work with grad students, but I do work a lot with undergrads, and I'm teaching an introductory course to our major currently. And even though the course is called Introduction to Technical Writing and Communication, I always tell people, my students included, pardon me, that there is a lot of broad applicability here. And so this forthcoming chapter from Ann Hill Dewin and others that I mentioned is really talking about content creation and content design. So your point is really well taken, that this is not just a tech comp thing, and that the principles of user experience and design and the technologies that underlie the work we do not only apply to quote-unquote technical communication. And as to your question as to why I kind of focused on the technical communication aspect, I think for me a lot of that goes back to the quote. This is just kind of a metaphor for, I think, what you're getting at. the Miles Kimball quote that I mentioned earlier, that, quote unquote, we are all technical communicators. So even though a user experience analyst may not be, called in her or his job a technical writer per se, that person is still doing a lot of work that is in effect technical communication, user
Right.
analysis, and things of that
That was kind
nature.
of where I wanted you to go, because
Yeah,
that's kind of
yeah,
my point usually with
sure.
most people, is that I basically am not a writer. I do some editing and sometimes I do some writing, but I've started out in content management and now I'm a digital content strategist. And, and I've actually studying up on user design because I work so closely with the UX designer. So, but that still falls under that umbrella. So, having that broader view kind of is kind of important going forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I really am glad you mentioned that, because that is such an important point.
Jeremy, this is Karen. I actually have a question. Regarding your discussion about technological literacy, you talked a lot about knowing the technologies that we use at work and whatnot, but how important also is it for technical writers to have some knowledge or background in the technological fields in which we work, whether it's aerospace or medicine or software development or whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think Karen, I think your question is really on point. And it's something that comes up a lot in industry as well as in the courses that I know that I teach. So something that actually came up in my course the other day is that um, there's a certain level of subject matter knowledge that we as technical communicators are often expected to have. Yet there's a certain threshold, and this is just the way that I think of it. Other people may have other thoughts, but I think of this as kind of like a threshold. So up to, and there's no hierarchy here. There's no good or bad or anything here. It's just a very simple kind of heuristic threshold that I think about. And in this threshold, you're a technical communicator. You are responsible for communicating certain content or subject matter knowledge to a given audience, often a lay audience, though not always. Within this threshold, there's a place at which, and I kind of jokingly say, you cease to be a technical writer and then you become the subject matter expert. So this kind of threshold model that I'm talking about is really illustrating this idea that in order to reach our users effectively, we need to be able to identify and work with both subject matter experts who have that kind of knowledge or domain-specific knowledge and the users as well. But I've always found it very useful to kind of play that, to be in an ideal spot in that threshold. And I think to your question, I don't know, I think a lot of it for me historically has fallen on the expectations of my employer. And, I really try, again, this goes to audience analysis. Ultimately, the people who hire us are people in industry, and we have to think of those people as a part of our audience, even if they're not our primary audience for a manual or a website or something to that effect. So I think the short answer to your question is where I am or where we are within that kind of, subject matter threshold, to me really depends on knowing what my employer wants, knowing what my stakeholders want, and then also understanding my audience as well as I can, and then trying to communicate those needs to the people I already mentioned, the stakeholders, the employers, and so on. But it really is a balancing act that I think even after 10 or 15 years in the field, we may still struggle with at times.
Okay.
But that's just my kind of my feeling on it.
All right, thanks. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, well, I have one more then, regarding your discussion about the gap between academic research and practitioners, and how do you think STC can help bridge the gap between academics and practitioners when it comes to research and research questions and some of those other things you talked about?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's something I have some pretty strong feelings or thoughts about. Um, and STC is certainly, in a lot of ways, is kind of leading the way in bridging that gap and kind of trying to create a forum for aligning academic research questions with industry needs. So a couple of the articles that I mentioned actually came from a special issue of Technical Communication, which of course is STC's home journal.
Right.
And it was a special issue on kind of the kind of positioning academic research in the field. So in my mind, STC can create a forum. STC, I don't think it's possible for any one person or any one group of people to kind of single-handedly create that sense of alignment. But I think that STC is a great example of an organization that can lead the way in creating a forum for conversations between academic researchers and practitioners. And the reason, or one of the reasons that this is really on point is that STC, as we know, includes both academic members as well as practitioner, actual people in industry. And I think it's fair to say that that is not always the case with every conference or every organization that exists in our field. So, and then to the second part, just very quickly, I really think, again, and I mentioned this, I think, in an earlier slide as well, to me, it's all about the conversation. If the academy and industry, or if researchers and practitioners are not in conversation with one another on a regular basis, then these kinds of alignments of research questions are simply not going to happen. So I think that one of my jobs as a researcher in the field is to try to help create those conversations and try to help create forums, even if they're informal, where we can talk about these things.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we have time for one more question. So if anybody has a question, please speak up. All right, so, okay, well, I guess that's it for today then. Jeremy, thank you so much for this. It's been very informative, and we've gotten some comments that people are enjoying it. So thank you very much for presenting this to us today. And
Yes.
everyone, I will have the recording posted in the next day or two up on our website at stcpmc.org in our past events area. So you can find it there. So have a good day, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
All righty. Bye-bye.